Criticism is one of those things that we assume we should be able to take on the chin, that maybe we should just have a thicker skin, but which oftentimes can feel like a personal attack. And I know in my case, there has been so many times when I have been so hurt by constructive criticism. And it's about recognizing that the more you understand criticism and its source and what it is that it's actually trying to tell you, the less likely you are to take it personally. And it's recognizing that when we look at criticism, it's so important to differentiate between someone's behaviors and someone's character. And oftentimes, this differentiation gets a little bit blurred, particularly when we have somebody criticize one of our behaviors or something it is that we've done. We do tend to assume that it's an attack on our character. And if we have grown up in any sort of critical environment, or if we have deep insecurities or a low self-worth, then of course we're going to take that as meaning that somebody else agrees with us, that we are inherently flawed. And it's about recognizing the impact that you allow other people's criticism to have on you, particularly on your character, is very much subjective. It's something that you have a certain amount of autonomy over. But again, you need to be aware of what it is that you're dealing with. And as well as that, whenever we are in a space of criticism, whether we are being criticized or whether we are criticizing other, there is disconnect. There is a rift between us and other people, and that is always going to make people feel bad. So it's about recognizing that oftentimes the criticism that we either create or that we receive is a consequence of just ridiculous standards that are very much socially driven. I mean, I think particularly for women from a very early age, we are pinned up against each other. There's this unspoken competitiveness where we are compared from an aesthetic perspective, where we're compared from how nice we are, about how compliant we are, about how sexy we are, about how good a mother we are, how good a partner we are. And unfortunately, it leads us into a place of feeling inadequate, looking at other women as potential threats as opposed to seeing them as people who are walking the same path and who potentially we have a lot in common with, and who we might be able to connect with if we weren't so busy feeling intimidated or feeling superior. Because again, we tend to oscillate between the two. We tend to assume that we're either so much better or so much worse than others. And no matter what, I suppose, side of the spectrum you're actually at, you are disconnected from yourself. You are judging yourself and you are judging others. So I suppose looking at the critical thoughts that we have of others, I mean, so much of this, as I said, is a reflection on how we feel about ourselves. If we feel inferior, if we feel inadequate, and particularly if we have grown up in an environment that was invalidating, judgmental, or critical, then of course we're going to look at other people and try to tear them apart in order to make ourselves feel better. And we do get a kind of a dopamine kick from superiority, and that's why we compare. You know, we look to other people and see how much better we are or how much worse we are, and it's just continuously moving away from the self. It's judging the self in comparison to others. It's basically tearing your own character apart on a daily basis, as opposed to looking inward and asking yourself, what is it in me that I need to work on so that I don't feel a need to compare myself to other people? Because again, oftentimes the standards and the comparisons that we're working through are things that don't actually reflect what's important to us. You know, we tend to look at achievements, we tend to look at aesthetics, we tend to look at things that don't necessarily reflect who it is that we want to be as a person. You know, like when I think about what's important to me, it's about being honest, it's about being true to myself, it's about being kind, it's about being accountable. And yet so many times I find myself comparing myself physically to other people, comparing myself as a mother, comparing myself as to how compliant I am, how good a partner I am. And again, it's not very helpful. helpful. It doesn't allow you to grow. It just keeps you in a very small place, and it keeps you in a negative place, because indeed when you're judging others, when you're judging yourself, I mean, you're creating all of these negative feelings of resentment, of envy and jealousy within you. And I suppose there's nothing wrong with any of those feelings or emotions per se. However, that being said, we need to deal with them as opposed to harboring them and, ruminating over them. We need to look at what message it is that they're giving us. And if we're looking at other people and feeling inadequate, oftentimes it tells us something that we're potentially missing in our own life, or else we're trying to mask over something that we're just not prepared to deal with. And if we're looking at somebody who's doing really well in their career, is there a possibility that we feel a little bit unfulfilled in our career? And that's why we're criticizing them and, kind of assuming that they're up themselves or that they don't deserve to be where they actually are. So it's being very honest with yourself about where those feelings come from, why you feel a need to criticize other people. But again, as I said, so much of this is a consequence of conditioning, and it's about also recognizing the role that that has to play in how you feel about others. Also, it's also, as I said, being very mindful of the relevance of what it is that you're feeling, because oftentimes we resent and criticize others for something that has no reflection on who we are, that is no business of ours. So be very aware of where your thought processes go. Then, when you receive criticism, as I said, oftentimes it can be really hurtful. And I suppose you have to ask yourself, how important is the person who is doing the criticizing to you? How much relevance do they have to your life? And then have a look at what it is that they're actually being critical of. I mean, if it's shoddy behavior, then perhaps, even though it's a little bit hurtful, you need to take that on board and take accountability for what it is that you've actually done. Whereas if a person is just being bitchy, or if they're just pointing out some of your personality, what they see as flaws, then you can just ask yourself, okay, do I really need to take this on board? Surely I have enough of my own internal judgment without having to deal with others. And it's about asking yourself, what's going on for them that they feel a need to bring me down, that they feel a need to make me feel badly about myself. And I suppose it's being very discerning about what you take on board and what you decide to just bin, because again, we can allow the opinions of others to tear us apart, to keep us in that very small place. But generally, when a person is being very critical towards us for no apparent reason, it's because they're hurting. And the more we can see that perspective, the less likely we are to be offended and to be hurt. And yeah, it's still going to sting a little bit, but we don't have to carry it with us for the next week, ruminating over what it is that they actually meant. Also, be very mindful of the fact that we tend to project meaning onto other people's statements. So they may have said something that was relatively benign, but it may have hit a nerve in us and caused us to think it was something a lot more serious or sinister. So be very aware of your assumptions about what other people say, your defenses and your insecurities, because again, oftentimes we can extrapolate some of our sensitivities onto things that other people say without even realizing it, and that's not very fair either. But again, as I said, it's recognizing that if the person isn't all that important to you, and if what they're talking about isn't really applicable to you, then you don't really have to take it on board. You can just discard it. Whereas if it is something that, okay, may be a little bit hurtful, but may also be helpful, then take it on board and make the changes necessary and be thankful for it. But again, as I said, be very aware of the judgmental aspect which we have all been taught to live in, and how it takes us away from our innate capacity to be loving, compassionate people who just see others as people who are walking the same path and who deserve respect and who deserve consideration, as opposed to seeing them as enemies who we are in competition with. I hope you find this a little bit helpful. If you'd like to work with me, get in touch with me on the website. It's fundamentals.ie.